talk organized by the University of Hong Kong Center for Comparative and Public Law. I'm Cora Chan, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Today we'll be discussing a fascinating new book by Professor Ron Hirschl entitled City-State Constitutionalism and the Megacity, published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. This book probes why, despite extensive urbanization, metropolises have not been given more prominent constitutional status and makes a compelling case for city empowerment. It has expressed normative underpinnings to alleviate poverty in cities, underrepresentation of urban voters, and problems of climate change, as well as to enhance subsidiarity. The book is agenda setting. It will significantly shape the scholarship and practice of constitutional law. It is also a very timely book, as the global pandemic has nakedly exposed the socioeconomic disparities that come with spatial inequalities. Today, we're extremely honored to have with us the author and two distinguished discussants. Professor Ron Hirschl is Professor of Political Science and Law at the University of Toronto and holder of the Alexander von Humboldt Professorship in Comparative Constitutionalism at the University of Göttingen. Ron, thank you very much for joining us, and many congratulations on this monumental piece of scholarship. Thank you. We're also very honored to have Professor Lorenzo Cassini from IMT School for Advanced Studies at Lucca, Italy, as well as Dr. Tong, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Hong Kong, as discussants. Thank you very much to you both for joining the event. Before we begin, a word about the logistics. After the presentations of the three speakers, there will be a Q&A session. So for members of the audience who would like to ask a question, please type the question in the Q&A box. You may do so at any time during the event. If you would like to direct the question to a particular panelist, please say so. And you may, if you wish, state your name and affiliation. So shall we begin then?
Absolutely.
Maybe I invite Professor Hirschl to speak to us about his book. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Cora, for this exceptionally generous introduction and kind words, and of course for the invitation to speak. And I thank Anna for organizing the event. And of course, my deep thanks in advance to Professor Cassini and Dr. Chiao for agreeing to engage with the arguments. I look forward to their thoughtful remarks. I think we all agree that we have an overdose of US elections over the last few hours. And one of the perks of the next hour and a half is that we can delve into a different universe. Or is it that different? We'll see. We'll see in an hour or so. So the way I would like to conduct this is I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and I will speak about the book a little bit, its main themes. Let's get started, and then we'll see where the discussion takes us. So let me just share the screen. And there you go. Can you all see what's on the screen? Excellent. So let's delve directly into what the book deals with. So in this graph, available online, it's not my own doing, we see the tremendous trend towards urban agglomeration, urbanization over the last 200 years. It's clear and obvious, we know the facts. But when we zoom in, and this is my own take on the data, we see something even slightly more interesting. The purple line represents world population. The blue line represents the world's urban population. So we can see that the purple line and the blue line are nearly parallel over the last 70 years. Translation, much of the growth in world population occurred in cities, or has been translated into growth of urban population worldwide. This is another way of telling the same story. The brown line is urban population over the years, and the green line is rural population. And of course, the trends are obvious. At around 2009, 2010, the world's urban population for the first time in recorded history passed that of rural population. This may seem daunting at first glance, lots of numbers, but really it's not. The left-hand side of the table conveys the proportion of urban population, of total population, by continent. I think that for our purposes, the more interesting part is the right-hand side of the right half of the table that shows the actual size of urban population by continent. And we can see, if we zoom in on Asia, in 1960, there were 360 million people living in cities in that continent. And the projections for the next 20, 30 years are more than 10 times, or about 10-fold increase in Asia alone. The same goes for Africa and Latin America. So we can dwell on that table later, but I just wanted to, this is another way of showing the same data. The green line that speaks for itself is the growth of urban, represents the growth of urban population in Asia. The orangish line in Africa, and the gray line in Latin America and the Caribbean. There has been some growth of urban population, of course, in Europe and North America, but not nearly in the same pace. Another simpler way of presenting the same data, over the last 60 years, approximately 88% of the growth of urban population worldwide occurred in the so-called global south. And the projection for the next 30 years is in the vicinity of 96%. So clearly this is, and we are not going to quarrel now about the term global south, but clearly this is a phenomenon that is concentrated and has been and will continue to be predominantly in the global south. This is just to set the stage for what is to come. The rise in the number of megacities over time, and obviously this is a reflection of the trends, the global demographic trends that we described a minute ago. Here is some more concrete numbers. Cities with a population of over 1 million a century ago was 12, 15. Now it's in the vicinity of 600, going to 1,000. You can see the numbers, they speak for themselves. In some cases, the numbers are absolutely mind-boggling, bordering on dystopian. And if you look at the bottom here, UN projection for the end of the 21st century suggests that a quarter of the world's population will be living in the 100 largest cities, and that cities such as Lagos, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Mumbai, and Karachi will have population of between 60 and in some cases 85 million. So these are some of these cities the way they look today, or parts of these cities. This is at the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria. I hope you can all see it takes some time to upload, so I hope you can all see the image. And let's wait a second or two for the image to upload. And this is Dhaka, Bangladesh. We will get back to that place later on. And of course, it speaks for itself. And this is Mumbai, India. I hope you can see. And I mean, I don't think there's any need to add anything. The photo speaks for itself. So this is how these cities look today. If we factor in the projections for the next half century, again, we are looking into a situation that borders on the dystopian. So this was the background against which I set to write this book. And here are the main things that I aim to accomplish in the book. First, I highlight the gap between the extensive study of the urban scene in the human sciences against the virtual, or between that and the virtual silence in constitutional thought. And I ask, why is that silence? The second thing I try to do is to explore what do constitutions say and do not say about cities worldwide. Then I focus on the global south. So virtually all attempts to grant cities status and standing took place in the global south. So I give a few examples and ask what may explain this geographic concentration. One of the major challenges that I try to take on in the book is how to materialize Henri Lefebvre's right to the city that has been largely abstract, with little attention by constitutional scholars, and I try to address that. So specifically, what makes cities unique as a unit, issues of density, super diversity, massive inequality, etc., frequent human interaction, and so on. What cities aim to do, measures such as urban citizenship, international city networks, human rights cities, and what concepts and doctrines from constitutional law may be put forward in granting cities enhanced constitutional standing. And while I do that, I also try to pay attention to innovative constitutional designs for addressing the urban-rural divide that, as we have seen, is becoming a major factor in electoral politics worldwide. So let's address some of these themes in slightly greater detail. We are not going to go into everything that is on the slide right now, but suffices to say that classical works of political theory have addressed the city, and we all know those. And then that the city has been the subject of countless utopian and avant-garde social thought attempts. And some of us are familiar with these works. And of course, novel thinking about urbanization in cities throughout the human sciences. And again, Henri Lefebvre is just one example, but many of you have heard about Saskia Sassen's groundbreaking work, and Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize on his work on economies of scale, and Richard Florida on cities and the creative classes, and Manuel Castells and Benjamin Barber on with his book, If Mayors Ruled the World, etc. So by stark contrast, very little of this intellectual flurry has penetrated constitutional law, let alone comparative constitutional law, where there's virtually nothing or very close to nothing on the issue of urbanization in the city. So constitutions tend to reflect a statist outlook. Cities are often viewed as creatures of the state and fully submerged within a Westphalian constitutional framework that emphasizes the state as the constituent unit. Here is another, another way of saying the same thing. Here are three major handbooks on comparative constitutional law, and for the sake of full disclosure, I'm among the contributors to two of them, and so I'm as responsible for this oversight as any other person. And we have here a total of more than 130 chapters stretched over 2,500 pages. And again, without a single chapter on the constitutional status of cities, home to the majority of the world's population. And that was the gap that I was trying to begin to close with this book. But clearly there's a stark gap that requires our as in the constitutional theory, constitutional thought, comparative constitutional law community that require that community's attention. So the next thing I try to do in the book is to ask, why is this constitutional blind spot? So what is responsible for this? And I, of course, speculate that there are a number of reasons for this. One is, of course, constitutional rigidity and path dependence. So, some constitutions were adopted well before the current wave of urbanization. And we all know how difficult it is to change constitutions. Then spatial statism. So this core idea, the Westphalian statist outlook embedded in national constitutions, the idea that national constitutions are well, nation building projects. And so they try to prioritize the nation state over or subnational units, but not cities. I also suggest that cities may be viewed as potential competitors, and in particular, sites of political unrest and potential threat to the regime. Um, of course, we have examples closer and farther from home, and Hong Kong is certainly an example for that. So cities, in terms of their geography, have some conditions like density and intense human interaction and presence of government buildings and public spaces and other things that may turn cities into sites of uprising. And of course, states are not happy with that. And another reason that I raise is that it may well be that large cities are consistently more diverse, cosmopolitan, and socially progressive than the rest of the polity, and we have numerous examples of that. Let's move on with a couple of examples from the so-called global north, mainly North America and Europe. So in the US, cities are virtually non-existent constitutionally. We cannot go into details. I'm happy to address this later. But the two leading decisions on the status of cities, on the constitutional status of cities in the US, remain decisions from over a century ago. And they essentially suggest that cities are creatures of the state and are subject to state jurisdiction. And that has been drawn upon by states or state governments in the US for what scholars have termed preemption legislation, whereby states preempt progressive city legislation and adopt legislation that bans and prohibits all sorts of progressive social measures in anything from minimum wage to sanctuary cities to gun control to sick leave, etc. So you might want to think that Canada is a more socially progressive national jurisdiction than the US, and you are right in many respects. But Canadian cities are arguably even in a worse position than US cities. So the relevant provision in the Canadian Constitution dates back to 1867. It subjects cities to the jurisdiction of the provinces. And I just remind the audience that this is a document that was adopted when the city of Toronto, for example, my hometown, had 50,000 people. Now it's home to 20% of Canada's population with 7.5 million. And at the bottom here, you see shall we call them the founding fathers of the Canadian Constitution, including John A. Macdonald in the middle. And I picked this picture just to show you three things. First, all male, compare this to city population today. Secondly, all white, compare this to metropolitan or metropolis population today. And of course, you look through the windows and you see how rural the landscape is. So this is as farther away it could be from contemporary urban settings. By contrast, when we look at this, some constitutional settings in the so-called global south, we see some action on city constitutional status. And I speculate that, some of it may relate to necessity, the fact that the vast majority of urban growth has taken place in the global south, and also some greater constitutional flexibility. So, newer constitutions, greater infiltration of politics into constitution making, etc. There are a number of models here. Some are more contested than others. So obviously the audience in Hong Kong will know much more than I do about the situation in mainland China. But China has of course, state orchestrated policy on cities and on big cities. And some of it includes the protection of 4 cities as so-called centrally administrated municipalities that are at least formally granted the status of that of provinces. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this from one of the commentators later. Of course, a different model has been adopted by countries such as Brazil, India, and South Africa, and this is very interesting. So here, it's not a designation of certain cities, it's the right to the city more broadly defined, and it applies to local government more generally, but with emphasis on urban centers. And in Brazil, this was part of the 1988 new constitution, accompanied by the so-called city statute, adopted in 2001, and this is one of the more progressive attempts to address city status in national constitutions. India tried to do this with 2 amendments in the mid-90s, not very successful for various reasons I discuss in the book. And perhaps the most interesting and ambitious attempt took place as part of South Africa's new constitution, or adoption of new constitution, in 1996, where an entire chapter was devoted to the status of cities. And this is an explicit reversal of an apartheid, discriminatory, to say the least, related urban policy. We can talk about it later. Another important example is what took place in Mexico City from 2013 to 2017. So Mexico City used to be a federal territory controlled by the federal government, and in a process that took 4 years, including the largest experiment to date in constitution making via moderated crowdsourcing, gained the status of a state like any other state in Mexico. And including amendment of the Mexican national constitution and the adoption of a new constitution to Mexico City qua state. Very interesting, for some reason, seldom explored in comparative constitutional law. We can talk about it later. Let me move on to some of the problems I identify in the book that may relate to the intersection of arguments we are familiar with from constitutional law and how to make those applicable to the city situation. So a series of issues that I identify in the book. One is what I call one person, half a vote. So this idea that in some countries, constitutionally entrenched electoral malapportionment essentially creates a situation whereby city interests are underrepresented systemically. I have a few examples here. We cannot go into details. I'll just maybe zoom in on the Mumbai example, where the city is home to over a quarter of the residents in the state of Maharashtra, but due to constitutionally entrenched malapportionment, it is only represented by 1/8 of the members of the state of Maharashtra in the national parliament. And there are numerous examples like that. We won't go into details. I'll elaborate on that in the book. And we have a phenomenon here, and that phenomenon, and some political scientists have alluded to this, is that or not alluded, suggested this in as many words, that in first past the post electoral systems, there is an inherent bias against urban dwellers, and that urban centers in such electoral systems tend to be underrepresented. And this is a main issue, not only in the US or Australia or Canada or the UK, it's a major issue in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nigeria, that, as we have seen, are sites of some of the most tremendous projected urban growth in the coming decades. Then we have the so-called Chicago-Zurich problem, whereby progressive cities are subsumed within electoral units that are not progressive, and the progressive vote is diluted. And what I do in that part of the book is go on to suggest, and of course I don't have the time, I can only scratch the surface of this just to, pique your curiosity, electoral system designs to consider that aim to address this problem while attempting to mitigate the so-called urban-rural divide, and we can go into details later. A second problem that I address in that part of the book is so-called is extreme density. And here the numbers are absolutely stunning. So in Dhaka, we're not talking here so-called slums. We are talking the entire city. So the average density in the entire city of Dhaka is 46,000 people per square kilometer, and you have this in miles for those of you who follow that system. And by comparison, you have some world cities, including Hong Kong, so that it gives you a perspective. And this is not even the densest, I mean, it's the densest city. The second is Manila, by the way, also, you know, in Asia. But in certain so-called urban slums, the numbers are even, you know, more extreme, with Dharavi in Mumbai, a density of nearly 300,000 people per square kilometer. And that's equivalent of squeezing the entire world population into the US state of Vermont. So just think about that. And of course, that's a nice illustration of essentially the same idea. You have here population density in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, in Dhaka, that, as we said, was the densest city in the world right now. And then you compare that to Dharavi, Mumbai. So good luck to those who live there. Another issue is urban superdiversity. So one of the distinct features of big cities worldwide is that they are super diverse. And this is a term used by sociologists referring to the intersection of several axes of diversity. And so obviously this occurs in large cities much more often than it occurs in other settings. And it may well be argued that this may create a distinct type of polity in terms of multiculturalism, diversity, accommodation, mutual respect for other cultures, and so-called difference. And we have I just picked, of course, the book is filled with data on that, but I just picked some stuff here for the slide. And of course, you see here that in Toronto, the percentage of first generation immigrants is 48%, and in the entire country is 21, and so on. So that is another issue I address. Let's move on here. And another issue is the constituent unit question. And I raised some ideas drawn from stakeholding theory, from the idea that the closer people are to, or the more affected people are by a decision, the greater the need for them to be represented in taking that decision. And issues of subsidiarity that are well known to all of us, the idea that a decision should be taken at the closest level to the people as possible, to the extent that that is possible, and that is entrenched in some EU legislation. And I say this because behind Lorenzo there, I see the EU flag, so I'm obliged to say that. And there are, of course, issues of fiscal federalism and equalization. So the basic idea here is, the transfer of resources from one subnational unit to another, and this is common in many federal countries. But it so happens that in big metropolis around the world, the intra-metropolis socioeconomic gaps far exceed those of the inter-subnational units. So if we apply the same logic, we might well consider some intra-metropolis distribution that may address extreme poverty in cities. Again, I'm just scratching the surface of these ideas by way of piquing your curiosity, and we can talk more about it during the Q&A. A couple of additional ideas before I turn to the commentators. Another issue in certain jurisdictions, certainly in North America concerning cities, but also in Europe to some extent, is the threat of sellout to corporate interests. So precisely because cities in many cases lack proper taxation capacity and are squeezed and pressured to deliver services to an overwhelmingly large population, but without having the appropriate constitutional status and taxation capacity, they are essentially forced to, in some cases sell out, in some cases accommodate corporate interests in a way that may not be suitable with the interests of the vast majority of city dwellers. And what we have here on the slide, and of course there is a major decision of the ECJ, European Court of Justice, on the status of Airbnb in Paris, and it's a big win for the mayor of Paris in that war. But there are other occasions, and in the US, this is a major problem. What you see here on the left is the bid of Boston to win the so-called Amazon HK2, so the second headquarters of Amazon, where the city of Boston essentially prepared a bid to Amazon that pays close to nothing income tax, and with a promise of investments of billions. And I think perhaps the most absurd case is at the bottom, you see this parking thing. The city of Chicago was in a dire financial situation a few years ago. So it essentially leased the entire parking revenue in the city of Chicago until 2083 to Morgan Stanley, if I'm not mistaken. And it, according to calculations of revenue, within the next year or two, it will have recouped the investment, Morgan Stanley, which was about 1.15 billion US dollars, and it will have 62 years remaining on the contract to collect parking revenue. Think about that next time you park in Chicago. Moving along, and I'm nearing the conclusion, another issue that I discuss is environmental protection. So obviously, as Cora mentioned in her introduction, this is a major challenge of facing humanity and that humanity faces. And we have to think about this creatively. And since the growing majority of the world's population resides in cities, cities are responsible for lots of, air pollution, garbage and garbage disposal, construction, consumption of goods, plastics, and all sorts of things that are directly related to environmental protection. And it just doesn't make sense to live cities, to leave cities without a say in this major problem. So I suggest that the constitutional empowerment of cities may give city authorities powers to address environmental issues in a way that is more effective. And we have an example of Buenos Aires that, by the way, was one of those cities that gained a state status in Argentina back in 1994 and became one of the greenest cities in the world and the greenest in Latin America. Perhaps the final issue I'll address is social housing. So obviously that's a big deal. And the evidence here is clear. The more autonomous, constitutionally, legally, and politically cities are, the greater the likelihood that they'll adopt progressive, accommodating social housing, also known, public housing, affordable housing. These refer to the same phenomenon, policies. And the best example I bring here, and of course, Hong Kong is a site of one, it's not ideal, but certainly the numbers are much higher than in many North American cities. In a landmark decision in South Africa, and I referred to the revolutionary status of cities in the South African Constitution back in 2010, the South African Constitutional Court confirmed the cities in that country have exclusive authority over municipal planning, including zoning and land use management, and that allowed the city of Johannesburg to adopt a policy whereby 30% of all new housing projects must include affordable homes, 30%, so a third. And there's nothing the state or the nation or the country can do to overturn that decision. And not surprisingly, Johannesburg is the recipient of numerous international awards in that context. I could go on, but our time is up, or my time is up. And so to conclude, maybe 2 or 3 take-home messages, and I'm happy to address some of the issues later. Spatial dimensions of constitutional government, that as we currently know them, rest on understandings of territoriality and sovereignty that are based on 19th century, early 20th century understandings. They require rethinking in the wake of, when we are facing extensive urbanization worldwide. So urban agglomeration is, I argue, among the most burning policy challenges of the 21st century. And the current figures are mind-boggling. There's absolutely no way that we as constitutional scholars can continue to ignore this phenomenon without thinking critically about it. And so I suggest, and in that respect, the book is more an invitation or an opening act towards a conversation in the coming few years than it offers conclusive answers. It's more, it has more questions than answers, I think. But like any first, I mean, just imagine how many books we have on, you know, freedom of expression or on judicial review or on freedom of religion. This is, to my knowledge, one of the first books in comparative constitutional law on the issue of cities and urbanization, and it's more of an invitation. So I argue that the silence of constitutional theory and constitutional thought and constitutional law with respect to the mounting urban challenge is not sustainable, and that new thinking about constitutionalism and urbanization is the call of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, for this clear and succinct summary of what are rich and sophisticated arguments in your book. And thanks also for the visual presentation of the powerful and impressive amount of data in your book for supporting the argument that there is a problem, or there are problems that need to be addressed, and that city empowerment is a new way of thinking about these problems. The book gives us this new lens. And once we're able to acquire this new lens, once we're able to liberate ourselves from old thinkings of spatial statism, we're able to think of possible new solutions. Whether they are effective solutions, we don't know, but at least new possibilities of thinking about the problem. So thank you very much, Ron. We now turn to the commentators. It is with great pleasure that I invite Professor Lorenzo Cassini to give your comments on the book.
Thank you, Cora. It was a true and real pleasure to be here and has the opportunity to say something about Rand's book. And I would start from the very end of the book, when Rand in the final page writes, finally, one of my favorite literary works of all time, Italo Calvino's Invisible City, a must-read novel for any aspiring comparativist, provided continuous poetic inspiration. In a deep symbolic way, its title reflects the main theme of this book, Invisible Cities. Now, of course, for an Italian, reading this line was something fascinating, because we used to grow up in school reading Invisible Cities in order to understand many of the problems that Rand was able to address in the book. And there is also something quite peculiar in having this webinar in Hong Kong virtually, because in that book, Marco Polo used to describe and illustrates to the Kublai Khan in the Far East the different kind of cities that the empire could host. So I would say that there is probably no better place than this to discuss the problems that we are trying now to address. Italo Calvino is one of the most famous Italian novelists. In one of his essays, he discussed the so-called hypothetical shelf. That is, when you have a writer writing a book, during the process, the writer at some point thinks of where at the end that book will be located and close to what other books. So it's like a hypothetical shelf that grows in your mind. And so you imagine what kind of books can be compared or can be similar to the book that you are writing. Now, Rand, also in this presentation, of course, gave us a shot of what kind of books try to address the issue. But and then this is a question that I will have to run at the end. So, but since, and I agree with you, the most important thing of this book is really filling a gap in focusing on such important problem. So what are the books that then you would suggest to read together with? I agree that one is Calvino's book. So, but then of course we are plenty of from history, from Plato to the ones that you consider. Now, I want to make a short reflection, starting from what I think is probably the most illuminating part of the book that basically gives in 2 words the concepts and problems that I try to deal with after reading the book. That is, I would say, not the title having the comma between city and state, that I found quite evocative and crucial, because that is the point. City, comma, state. Pay attention, not city hyphen state, as we used to find since Athens. So it's not this attempt to have city-states. Is this, I would say, unavoidable coexistence of city and states. So my reflection will try to see how basically this tension that we always have experienced in the history of humanity. So on the one hand, the tension to establish a city, to have a stronger city and to have important city, but on the other hand, to have something bigger than a city, to have something that brought to the concept of state. Since ancient Greece, you have leagues of city-states, because there was this need to have something bigger, something larger. And to some extent, the process that we experience in Europe since 13th century, when you have constitutions of cities, no? The Siena Constitution was the statute of the city of Siena. There was a process to go over what Thomas Hobbes called civitas, that was the state. So it was still something connected between city and state, and then to have the modern state. So this is something that is quite clear in the book. So Rand, I mean, according to me, is not suggesting, of course, a process going back forward saying, okay, now we should move to city-state. But the question he raised that is fundamental during this time is how, with the states still so strong, and I don't see actually a decay of the state as a political entity. I see a decay of democratic state, or I mean, of a crisis of democratic state, but not of a state as a political entity. So in this moment, how can we cope? How can we deal with these emerging megacities powers with the data that since the beginning of the book Rand shows? And this is quite astonishing, because basically you start the book, you are overwhelmed with data, but it's quite effective because, okay, I cannot escape this problem. So I have to deal with this problem, because that's the political scientist winning over the lawyers, no? So that, okay, this is the facts. So this is the data. So don't try even to turn your head, because this is something that we have to address. And so I want to add a few examples that perhaps can offer other arguments to what Rand tries to identify. So, for example, Rand, in a part of the book, displays how at the international level there is some attention to cities. So even if constitutions, for the reason also that Rand summarized in the presentation, beside the global south and the new constitutions often forget the cities, or you don't see enough what you would like to see now. At the international level, there is an attempt to have a sort of recognition of the role of cities. So I will add some examples. Olympic Games. So Olympic Games and the Olympic charters and all the system built on the International Olympic Committee is based on host cities. It is the city, the legal entity recognized to the extent that you have a contract between an international institution and the city. So you don't have the state level. The government have to endorse, take part, but the legal entity is the city. Second example, the UNESCO system for protection of historic cities, or even the World Heritage Sites, is driven by the states. But when you have a site within a city and you have to protect it, then there is a direct interaction between the UNESCO and the municipal authority. So somehow the city is recognized as the main actor to deal with the heritage site. Third example, quite interesting, is that when the government of Internet, the ICANN, decided to expand the number of domain names, beside the geographic indication of countries, of state, so like Italy or like France, so .it, .fr, open also to cities. So you have now .Berlin, .NYC, .Paris. So, I mean, I'm giving this example just to confirm that these importance, significance, and role played by city is probably much more perceived than we can imagine, also beyond the state. So when you have these international actors and they go directly to the city. So my additional comment that it's not, it's something that I'm still reflecting after reading the book, because at the end, I mean, coming from administrative law, but spending my time at Constitutional Court and trying with Igonest together with Ran and many colleagues to go over any boundaries. So I was thinking of, okay, why is he insisting so much on constitutional law, no, on the because for many aspects, the problem that you raise can be easily addressed, also boosting the special administrative powers or the regulation. So in many cases, probably you do not need a constitutional amendment to solve the kind of problems that you raise. And so I was wondering, okay, why this constitutional implication? And while at first I was skeptical, then I mean thinking, I mean I realized that probably the reason, and so I share this approach, that constitutional scholarship is very, very far from focusing on these problems. So so it's not a matter of putting the things into a single box, no? So okay, this is a constitutional law issue, but it is true that the constitutional implication of cities that not necessarily should be solved with a constitutional amendment or with a constitution recognizing a specific status. That, I mean, in many cases, as your book demonstrates, it happens, no? Because capitals, for example, in many cases already have a specific status. Or the example of Tokyo that you make in Japan, no? With the double hat, with the role splitting, is something that, for example, we have in Italy, even if our constitution doesn't explicit, with mayors. So the mayor is in many cases also official of the government. So he basically acts as an official of the government directly for civil registry, for many functions that exercise directly as representing the government without any intermediation. So many issues can be solved. But I really understood from your book then, and then I went on my mind on the constitutional scholarship, that the place of city is really undercovered. So so I understand your call for action, that I would expand, because for administrative lawyers, for urban law experts, I mean, city is the dimension. So you start from city. You don't even think sometimes of state. In many cases, you don't even have a state plan. You have only city plan, you have city regulation. So city is the dimension, but you don't think of the constitutional implication. On the other hand, constitutional lawyers see the states, and they don't think of how now megacities can of course, offer all the kind of issues and elements that you underline. So, and to conclude, I really believe that this book in our time is a must read, because you must, thanks to the number of data and reflection and I mean, quite a straight way of addressing the comparison between federal systems and non-federal system, and the problems that all these can raise, you start thinking. So this is a book that raises questions. So Ran was right. You don't find here the solution. But that's, I think, that the most important thing that the book can offer. So give you the possibility to think, to reflect. And this is what, at least to me, the book gave, because I started thinking of many of the implications intersecting different disciplines, different kind of laws and different countries. So it was really, really wonderful to have this opportunity. So I thank you again for this, and I stop now.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for these interesting and illuminating comments. In particular, I agree with you that one point to note in relation to the book is that Ron is not arguing for cities to replace states. The book argues for cities to be given more status, to exist alongside, so something bigger than cities as we traditionally envisage. And I think the title City, State really captures that very well. Although after reading the book, I did wonder what the implications of the arguments would be for public international law. So might there be a bigger role for cities as an international autonomous actor in international law? So I think the book is going to have implications not just in the field of constitutional law, but in so many other different fields, including in public international law as well. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. May we now invite Dr. Qiao to give his comments. Tong, over to you.
Thank you, Cora, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to read Professor Ron Hirschl's book, which I enjoy reading it very much. So I'm here probably not as a comparative constitutional law scholar, but more as an urban law scholar. So it's really a great pleasure, because finally, I think after publication of this book, now I don't have to explain to others the importance of cities and also the importance of urban law. I participated in a conversation, obviously quite related to this book, not literally, but related to the topics of this book. Just I think last November in Italy, in Rome. So we have a group of what we call urban law scholars from the United States and also from Europe. We are basically plotting kind of revolution, just like what your book, Professor Ron Hirschl's book, has been doing, right? It's not only that comparative constitutional law scholars have paid very little attention to the importance of cities. It's actually, I think, overall the legal field had paid relatively, I would say, quite little attention to cities. I mean, many of the issues I'm discussing in this book, right? Housing, the nature of cities, right? And also the city power, city autonomy, these kinds of topics, they are not entirely new, as Professor Ron Hirschl has pointed out in the book, and they have been discussed many hundred years ago, many centuries ago. They are also currently under discussing by, for example, urban planning scholars, political scientists, but legal scholars generally speaking, have paid very little attention. So I think it's a really good thing. That we now have a heavyweight to be on board to talk about cities. Just a bit more information about the urban law thing. So I think it's also a burgeoning field. So scholars, as you have cited in your book, like Richard Strager, Robert Barron, right? Richard Strager at Virginia, Robert Barron used to be at Harvard, and also Sheila Foster at Georgetown, Nestor Davidson at Fordham, and also a group of scholars at NYU. They have already, started at least covered many of the topics in your book, but mostly it's really urban law, not a constitutional perspective. As far as I know, Paul Romer, another Nobel Prize winner in economics, he's actually teaching law of cities currently at NYU, and myself have taught a lot of cities in Hong Kong for a couple of years, and I'm going to teach it again. So in the spring, just to say, I do think it's a burgeoning field, and you are the first scholar from the Kong law background. I think that's really great. So that being said, I do want to maybe explore a bit. I mean, in light of your very sort of a book about the fundamental questions you have been asking, right? So what's the nature of cities, right? And what's special about cities? But more specifically, I'm now trying to think from the perspective of comparative or constitutional law scholars, right? So there are at least two questions. Firstly, what can cities do for constitutional law? I think that answer is relatively clear, because you have mentioned in your book, for example, like sanctuary cities, like climate change, right? San Francisco, I remember a couple of years ago actually said it would join the Paris Agreement, but not literally join, but basically to say, since the US government has, dropped out from the agreement, the San Francisco as a city is going to, follow the rules of the Paris Agreement. So, or just imagine if the United States now are all cities, right? The election would be a totally different image, right? A different reality. So that's to say, well, cities can put forward many progressive agenda. So it's no wonder we see Professor Ron Hirschl's book, and also remember a couple of years ago, Heather Gerken, whom I think you also cited in your book, had this calling for like a federalism all the way down. It's also kind of like advocacy for more power, more influence, more autonomy for cities. So that's clear. So cities can really bring forward lots of the progressive agenda that are kind of currently kind of like stuck, right, in national or international politics. But the other side of the equation is a bit more complicated, and that's also what I try to learn from this book, right? So what could Constitution do for cities? I think Professor Ron Hirschl has at least, partially answered this question and also pointed to us to the direction. But I think that's a question probably we can think a bit more. I'm going to probably address like one point later, because I think one central argument made by Professor Ron Hirschl is about like the emancipation, right, or the enhancement of city power. So I generally agree with that argument, but I'll just add probably a bit more sophistication later. Okay. So yeah, that's the second part. But it's so exciting. So let's return to the first point. Like, what's special about cities? Like, right? So you mentioned agglomeration, right? You mentioned density. So the two things, as I say it, are very much interconnected with each other, right? Because agglomeration basically means density, right? Because you want people to get together in a specific place. And according to economists, that you don't have, it doesn't have to be any specific place. As far as people getting on a place, right? Then agglomeration can happen, innovation can happen, and economic development can happen. So that means density. And currently, at least for economists, they really want more density. Maybe not in India, but at least like in New York and in San Francisco, and maybe even in many of the megacities in China. They want more density because, for example, Edward Glaser, the leading urban economist, will say density is good, is efficient, is environmental friendly, right? So I was a bit, I don't think it's necessarily in conflict with your discussing about density and also the poverty related to density. I mean, one of the chapters, right? But I do think there is a maybe a bit more clarification about agglomeration and density would be nice, right? So that's one thing. But going back to agglomeration, the other part, I used to be a very firm believer of cities and also agglomeration, right? Or Edward Glaser called the triumph of cities, right? He would say cities are the single most important invention of human civilization, right? But one thing that caused a bit caution is about the inter-regional implications of agglomeration, right? For me, as far as the econ theory goes, agglomeration is great for the city, right? Where the agglomeration is ongoing. I mean, there are problems like housing things we're going to talk about, right? But it's bad for places which have been, left out by agglomeration. So, right, so that's what we're talking about, the rural areas or the cities that have declined or even died, right? So, so agglomeration, in a sense, I would say, if we think from a national or international perspective, it's actually a winners take all, right? It's basically the megacities, they dominate the market of local governments. They are just much more attractive than other smaller cities, and also much more attractive than rural areas. So in that sense, inequality, right, inter-regional inequality is actually the natural consequence of agglomeration. So that does not deny the importance of agglomeration or cities are the most important creation of human civilization. But I do think that might be a dark side of agglomeration. So that's the first thing, right, about the nature and what's unique about cities. The second one, I think we can come back to the internal governance of cities, because they have mentioned like social and economic rights and also the housing affordability crisis currently ongoing in Hong Kong, in New York, in San Francisco, right? And they also talk about that cities are very likely to to be more linked or to be captured or to be more favorable to business interests, right? I think that's generally true. But one part I don't get completely is how the enhancement of city power, for example, taxation, which you have mentioned, would actually contribute to the solution of such an internal governance problem. Because from my perspective, the problem for business interests or the global mobile capital is that they are much more mobile than, for example, individual citizens, and they have a much bigger bargaining power, right? So that's why, as you have said, New York and many other cities in the States, they are competing, right? Giving lots of subsidies so as to have the second headquarters in their city. I'm just wondering how, for example, the enhancement of city autonomy or city power could potentially solve that problem. It's just seriously, I just haven't figured out the details, right? But talking about internal governance, I do actually have a co-author paper with Wendell Pritchard, who is at Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. We are talking about actually a related thing. The paper is called exclusionary megacities. So we are trying to understand basically this relationship, right? What's wrong with cities? So what we say is not just business interest, because we know currently in American cities and in many other cities, what economists call the home voters, the homeowners, the NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. That's also quite a significant phenomenon. And that actually has stood in the way of development in many cities. So eventually our conclusion, because actually like leading urban law and policy scholars like Vicky Bean, who is at NYU and currently is a vice or deputy mayor of New York City. So she had a paper talking about like a growth machine represented by like developers and the business interests, business corporations. So growth machine versus home voters, right? So her idea is that actually cities should be more like growth machine. So let corporations, like developers have their way so that we can develop more business and also develop more housing. But eventually our idea is that it's not really business corporations versus home voters. It's people who own property, including housing and also like business corporations who own property versus people who don't, right? So we think the problem, so Wendell and I, we think the problem of urban governance is really that urban governance, partly due to its origin, kind of like public corporation, is very much structured around or centered on property. It could be business property, it could be real property. So the whole architecture is designed to maximize property interest, I mean, broadly defined. Therefore, it has so therefore the voice of citizens who don't own property, their voice is not heard or is not as significant, as powerful as either the business corporations or property voters or property owners, right? So that's I guess my question or comments on the internal governance, right? The social economic rights, how to balance citizens versus either business corporations or property owners. So I think my time is running out, so that's naturally comes back to the final point, right? So what's exactly the nature of cities? I thought there were maybe two choices. Since you have talked about like Plato and other classical writings, I think in the literature there are two things. One is treating cities as corporation. So if today you go to like the city of London, the website, if you Google now, you'll see it's like a City of London corporation. That's one like a historical legacy. But the other, I think in the ancient writings, is more like taking cities as a polis, right? Like the community, a polity, which the governance of which would be really based upon citizenship instead of like property or corporations, right? So again, congratulations to Professor Ron Hirschl for the great book. It's really a pleasure. So I'll conclude with just the last question, because you were indicating that I should talk a bit about China, and I won't, but just maybe an anecdotal story. I used to show my students in the law of cities a slide in which the mayor of Shanghai and the mayor of San Francisco. So the mayor of San Francisco was visiting Shanghai. So they are sitting together, right? Like face to face. I was asking my students, do they see any problem with this picture? So if you know Chinese politics, you see immediately there is a problem. Why? Because the mayor of Shanghai is actually a national politician. I mean, the number one, the party secretary of Shanghai, is a national politician. He is one of the top 25 party cadres in the entire country. While the mayor of San Francisco, as I understand, is basically nobody. I mean, in American politics, right? So they are not really equal to each other. So I think they are, firstly, is since we're now taking cities as a subject of comparative constitutional law. So how are we going to compare different kinds of cities? That's really a methodology question. And the last word, is really to say, when you talk about the enhancement or the emancipation of cities, right? Like call for city power. What do you mean exactly? Because the Chinese case tells that the city actually becomes more powerful when it's integrated with the national political system, instead of like being separate or independent from the national political system. So I think theoretically that will be linked to, like again, Heather Gerken's point about sovereignty and servants, right? So the sub-national units actually to be integrated to the national political system could potentially make them more powerful. But I'll stop here. Really wonderful book. I greatly enjoy reading it, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Tong, for sharing your expertise in property law, Chinese law, and urban law. I'm looking at the clock, and we have 15 to 20 minutes left. Ron, I wonder if it'd be okay with you if we take 2 questions from the audience first before passing it on for you to reply to all the comments that have been given both by the commentators and the audience so far. Would that be okay?
Of course.
Yep. Okay, so I think Pojen has a question. Pojen, would you like to ask it in person since you're here? Yep, Pojen.
Ron, thank you for doing this, and congratulations for writing a riveting book. I read it in one sitting over the weekend, so it's a magnificent contribution to our field. And if I understand, one of your central arguments is that we should constitutionalize city power in light of the density of cities, in light of the relative power they have to global finance and the global supply chains. So I'm asking, your book, I understand, should be probably finalized before COVID-19 became a global pandemic. So my question is, in light of COVID-19, and we know that when COVID-19 is ravaging the world, many city mayors, for example, like the mayor of Manchester was resisting Prime Minister's Boris Johnson's attempt to lock down the country to a greater extent than the mayors wanted. So I'm wondering, in light of this health concern, how would you modify, if at all, your arguments? Because if cities were to if city power were to be constitutionalized and they're given more autonomy from federal national governments, then arguably city governments will have more constitutional power to resist a national solution to a health emergency.
Thank you, Pojan. I'm going to ask one more question from Dan Matthews, our colleague in the audience. The question is quite well framed, so I'm going to read it out by and large without summarizing it. It says, to what extent does your focus on the city rather than the broader processes of urbanization, which engage a range of non-urban spaces, limit the possibilities for experimental constitutional thinking about cities? And he has in mind Neil Brenner's criticisms of the city centricism of urban studies, which tends to ignore underlying drivers of urbanization. So the question is, does the focus on the city alone frame out the various externalities, for example, environmental harms that processes of urbanization cause? And how might new urban constitutional thinking also become conscious of these non-urban spaces, which are nonetheless essential to the process of urbanization? So over to you, Ron.
Thank you, Cora, and thank you for these tremendously thoughtful questions. So obviously there's a lot lots on the table, and if anything, it confirms my, and I think Lorenzo said it in his own words better than I did, that that the book puts on the table and brings to our collective scholarly attention a major gap in constitutional thought, and it's a collective undertaking. The book may claim to be, I mean, may lay a credible claim to be the first one to do this in comparative constitutional law, but it's certainly not a conclusive set of solutions to all the problems that have been raised. It's an invitation to talk about these issues with some tentative suggestions. And so let me try in a couple of minutes, and hopefully we'll be able to squeeze another question or two, we'll see, to address some of the issues. So raised. So first of all, on Lorenzo's really thoughtful and erudite comments. And Lorenzo is one of the most exceptionally erudite colleagues I've had an honor to talk to, and we work together in the ICONS context for years now. And I think we sat together at that little place next to NYU, envisioning the whole idea of ICONS. It's always a pleasure to listen to Lorenzo's thoughtful ideas. He always brings this really erudite perspective that none of us can match. And in that respect, I second his, I think third, because I made it and Lorenzo seconds it, and I now want to third it. Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities is a must read. And if there is a book to be coupled with my book in this context, it is Calvino's Invisible Cities, a masterpiece, Nobel Prize quality in literature, that only Calvino's premature death probably prevented that from happening. I want to address some of Lorenzo's more specific points. It's absolutely fascinating, his ideas about, the Olympic Games, UNESCO heritage sites, internet domains. These are all areas where cities begin to gain presence on the international scene. And I do discuss in the book, and Cora mentioned this in passing, I think one of the chapters, if I recall, I never go back to these books after I write them, but if I recall, it's chapter 4, attempts by cities for self-empowerment. So not waiting for the constitutional system to adjust, but trying to act proactively to enhance their power. And there have been a set of measures that cities have been taking, and in particular, as Tong mentioned, in climate change and in other areas. So this in international public law. So what I take from Lorenzo's comment in general is that this is not just an issue of constitutional law. And when I wrote the book, I focused on constitutional law for two reasons. One is because I view constitutional law as, obviously I'm a scholar of constitutional law, so I'm biased, but I view constitutional law as something that has this elevated symbolic quality over administrative law or municipal law. It's not just telling us who does what. It's not just about separation of powers or distribution of powers. It's also a reflection of who we are as a polity, of what values we choose to prioritize in our constitutive document. So in that respect, I think that it is expected of good constitutions to reflect some of the biggest problems of our time, much like address environmental and climate change issues, etc. So my view of constitutional law is not just as a body of law, but as a political statement, as a deep political statement, and as a part of our meta-narrative of who we are. And in that respect, I thought that it ought to reflect the issue of urbanization in cities. And of course, I endorse everything that Lorenzo said in terms of the need to bring together municipal law / urban law, administrative law, but again, and public international law, as Cora suggested. But I still think that constitutional law has this quality to it that makes it poetically or symbolically larger than these other bodies of law. So that's what I wanted to reflect. Of course, I cannot do justice to everything Lorenzo said. And now moving on to Shitong's really thoughtful comments. So look, everything you say is right on. I did not approach all of this through, let's call it constitutional / institutional economics. Of course, I am, I'm citing all these works, and I have the honor now of getting live updates on what Glaser thinks, because my son, who's currently an undergrad at Harvard, takes a course with Glaser, who's a major luminary in the context of urban economics. So like every Tuesday and Thursday, I look forward to updates on Glaser's recent thoughts on these things. I take everything you said, Shitong, seriously. It just was only that much I could do in a book with a focus on constitutional law and on the legal dimensions, without leaving outside these major issues that you raised. But I just felt that this is more for economists to think about, and it's not, it wasn't my expertise. A very interesting point that you make is the point about density and agglomeration. I must confess that, it's always fascinating to write these books. But the 10 pages where I talk about density, to me, and I think it's in chapter 5, to me, were by far the most interesting to research and to explore. Think about this, the whole idea of density, either extreme density in big cities or very low density, sparse in the hinterland, so to speak, is a major challenge. This entire spatial dimension of sovereignty that has been largely neglected from constitutional thought, that treats the entire territory as one, on one flat dimension without paying much attention to density issues, was by far the most interesting and intriguing set of ideas. So I definitely, I'm only scratching the surface of this in the book, and there's only, that much I could do, but thank you, Shitong, for raising this. On China, obviously, you are the authority in the proverbial room here, so I'm not going to counter anything you said. I will just say that in many respects, China in this context is an outlier. So definitely, when you compare it to the more, from my perspective, authentic, bottom-up, progressive attempts to empower cities, I would look at Brazil or India or South Africa or Mexico City. China is, as you just said it, is a state-centered attempt to empower cities, not as a counter-state measure, but rather the opposite, to empower cities as engines of economic growth as part of a national plan of various sorts in various directions. So I second everything you said on this. I will just say that I mentioned China in that context only for the sake of surveying the various approaches towards empowering cities, and by no means endorsing the Chinese example as the poster child of how things should look. Quite the contrary, if you read the book, it's clear, of course you did, it's clear that my approach to this is quite critical, and I would rather go for the Brazil or South Africa solution to this. Again, lots on the table, but there's only that much I can address. Let me, to Pojan's question on COVID. If at all, I think that the pandemic, and you're right, I just submitted the manuscript back in March when the pandemic just started to rise. And if at all, my understanding of the stats and the facts and the numbers is that the situation only reinforces the argument, and that the costs, not just financial, but costs of governance falling on mayors in large cities in addressing the pandemic have been tremendous. So cities and mayors are at the forefront of many of these issues in terms of healthcare and education and other challenges. And since some of the major points of the book is attention to the global south, I also make the point that in quite a few large cities in the global south, the most basic measures, social distancing and washing hands, the most basic anti-COVID-19 measures that everyone is assumed to have access to are tall order if you live in some of those third world countries. So again, it's not the right term, but you know what I mean. So if at all, I would think that more policy making to mayors and to cities would be a more effective means of addressing COVID. Of course, without suggesting that national approach is to be replaced by a city-based approach to this. I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the
Dan
question.
Matthews. Dan.
Thank you, Dan. So thank you, Dan, for a really thoughtful question. And yes, I refer to Neil Brenner's work in passing. And again, not much more than that. My answer to this is that, and we haven't had a chance to emphasize this, but really what we face here is on the one hand, rise of urbanization in megacities, and at the same time, rise of major political tensions between cities and the non-urban electorate. In many countries, this is becoming a major issue. And we need, as constitutional scholars, and remember, this is a book in constitutional law, thinking about finding constitutional and institutional and legal solutions or to mitigate some of the problems. There are no solutions. There is mitigation. Solution is for others. For me, it's attempts to create constitutional measures that would help address or mitigate some of these issues. And in that respect, what I try to do in the book, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it, just it was at the bottom of one of the slides, is to offer an array of constitutional designs that try to mitigate the tension between the urban and the rural. There are big challenges here, not least the rise of the suburban. So the entire division between rural and urban is questionable in many countries because of urban sprawl and the rise of the so-called suburban. And it's not entirely clear where to draw the line, and that goes back directly to your question. What is the demos here, to take a political theory to use? What is the demos? If we compare this to countries, countries have passports, have boundaries, have citizens, have all these things. Cities, people can come and go. So the question is, what is the relevant demos and where to draw the line legally and politically and constitutionally? I do try to address some of the issues that you raise in innovative constitutional designs. We cannot go into details, but electoral systems that would enhance city power and at the same time not alienate and at some extent enhance the causes of urbanization or address the causes of urbanization. And I even allude to radical solutions. Those of you who might have picked it up. Thomas More in Utopia talked about, this is some 500 years ago, suggested that on the island of Utopia, there are 54 cities and none is larger or smaller than any others. And so one of the crazy, but who knows, ideas we might want to explore is to limit the rise of megacities and of population constitutionally. It seems wild, but it may be that when we talk about cities with 80 million people, maybe it's not such a crazy idea. Anyways, there's only that much I can do, and we are running out of time. So I'll punt it back to Cora.
Thank you so much, Ron. Your final point confirms point that I had in mind when I was reading your book, which is that you are not, so it's not necessary for you to support the idea of urbanization or megacities in order to make the arguments that you make, because your key argument is that we should deal with these problems at a constitutional level, and your final radical idea it confirms my thinking on that. I'm looking at the clock and time is up already, but there is one question that has been sitting in the Q&A box, and if we're all ready to overrun by 10 minutes, perhaps we can take that question as well. Would that be okay with all of you?
Sure.
Okay, so that question is from Dr. Biljana Petkova, affiliate scholar from Georgetown Center on Privacy and Technology and Yale ISP. It says that a core principle of the rule of law is that law should be equally applied. Do you see a certain tension between the principle of equality and cities flexing their muscle to gain constitutional recognition? And actually, to add to that, as I was reading the book, I was thinking about the people who suffered in rural districts. Urbanization brought problems distinct to cities, but it also brought problems in non-rural, non-urban landscapes. So space empowers when it's scarce, but it can disempower when it's not scarce. So I guess the question is, and I think some of your normative basis for city empowerment could be applied to for arguing for empowerment of local governments at the rural level as well. And so I guess the question is, to what extent can your arguments be extended to an argument for empowerment of local governments generally for both urban and rural landscapes? And if not, if you wish to privilege cities, why might that be the case? Might there be underlying assumptions that have not been fleshed out?
Thank you, Cora, and thank you for a thoughtful question. Again, I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the question.
Biljana.
Thank you. So an excellent point, and I had to really think hard about these issues. From a constitutional standpoint, I would make a number of arguments. First, I make a big deal in the book about ideas of subsidiarity and the unit in federal law. And of course, ideas of subsidiarity may apply to local government in general, and they have been applied to local government in general in the European context and in other constitutions as well. Again, Lorenzo will correct me, but to my understanding, ideas of subsidiarity are embedded in Article 5, one of the subsections of the emerging European Constitution, and let's call it that way.
The treaty.
The treaty. Treaty sounds good, and one of those terms, and elsewhere. So I definitely explored the idea of subsidiarity as potentially applicable to other forms of local government, as well as ideas of stakeholding and democratic stakeholding. I just went through this in passing. Another idea that I explore is the idea of community standards. So this is concept, or in the European context, margin of appreciation, which is a slightly different way of thinking about the same problem. So it's not entirely clear to me that the statist understanding of applying the Constitution 100% equally across the territory without sensitivity to the nature of the nature of local government is the best of ideas. And we could think, I understand the statist logic in it, but we could think about applying ideas of so-called community standards beyond the typical context. It has been invoked, freedom of expression and others, to address issues where the big tension is the imposition of quote unquote urban values upon rural communities and vice versa. So we could think about allowing some greater leeway and flexibility in applying constitutional standards across the territory without, and I'm being realistic here, without breaking the statist monopoly over constitutional law. And that's another idea to think about. Another idea to think about in this context, and maybe I'll stop here because these are difficult questions that require more thinking, is the idea of equalization. And I just went through this in passing, but this is also a potentially radical idea. So, you know, in the German Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, and many other federal constitutions, not in the US, there is this idea of inter subunit transfer of wealth from the more well-off subnational units to the less well-off subnational units. But we can think about it, and going back to Xitong's, one of Xitong's points, we can think about it in the context of within a subnational unit, the transfer of wealth from different localities to other localities, and even more radically, within the city from the well-off neighborhoods, and we have to think about the unit here, from the well-off neighborhoods to the extreme poverty neighborhoods. And remember, the focus here is on the global south. So there's lots to be thinking about. In general, I will say that the questions you raise here, Cora and Rihanna, are on the mark in the sense that one of the big tensions in writing this book is trying to find a delicate balance between special status to cities by virtue of numerous issues we've discussed over the last 90 minutes or so, and there's no time to repeat that, and no sense. And at the same time, maintaining an equal treatment approach throughout the polity. And that's exactly the challenge that all of us constitutional thinkers, or most of us constitutional thinkers, need to think about. How to appreciate the uniqueness of the city as a unique form of human settlement and a unique form of a polity, and at the same time, not breaking the rules and going back to medieval times, you know, sort of the new medievalism, whereby cities were the constitutive units and the main polities in the pre-nation state era. And that's the biggest challenge here. And what I'm trying to do is to navigate this uncharted terrain from a constitutional standpoint and try to begin to sort out what are the arguments pro and con, and try to make some tentative solutions for if I may say humbly here, for a first of its kind book that's as good as you can do. And let's hope the conversation begins in the near future.
Thank you so much, Ron. Please join me in thanking all three speakers. Ron, Lorenzo, Shitong, thank you so much for the excellent presentations. You've certainly given us a very educational break from the US elections. And I think all of us in this room agree, to borrow from Adrian Stone's words on this book, that this book is going to has laid out rich new veins of research that will be influential for decades to come. And these veins would include, they range from exploration of the constitutional structures and tools for empowering cities. I look forward to reading works, or even myself exploring works, elaborating the very interesting proposals in Ron's book towards the end of the book, which we didn't get to discuss in detail. And at a theoretical level, how the empowerment of cities is going to implicate theories of federalism, sovereignty, pluralism, at an empirical level, that as Shitong has pointed out, how are we going to compare cities And also, do we have empirical data on the relative competences of central local regimes, as Po-Jen has pointed out, the different levels of regime functioning during a pandemic, for example? What are their relative competences and motivations? So lots and lots and lots of interesting work that will come out of this book, inspired by this book. So thank you very much, Ron, and congratulations on the book. Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Tong, and thank you to all of you for joining, tuning in from various time zones. If you wish to buy the book, please refer to the discount flyer in the email sent to you. If you have any problems accessing the discount code, just let us know. Thank you very much again, and good luck in navigating these challenging times.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Ron and Lorenzo.